The conference room on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Toronto, and I remember thinking as I walked in that morning how strange it was to see something so beautiful right before your world falls apart. My brother-in-law sat at the head of the table. My mother-in-law was to his right, in her cream Chanel blazer, her reading glasses perched at the tip of her nose. The family's lawyer, a silver-haired man named Edward Croft, was already shuffling papers. My husband, my soon-to-be ex-husband, didn't even look up when I walked in. The documents were already prepared. I was 29 years old, 8 years into a marriage I had poured everything into, and I was about to sign away my 40% stake in Beaumont and Sons Holdings, the company I had quietly rebuilt from near bankruptcy while my husband took credit at every gala, every Bay Street dinner, every interview in Canadian Business Magazine. My mother-in-law looked over her glasses at me and said, with the kind of politeness that is somehow worse than cruelty, "We appreciate you being cooperative, dear. This really is the cleanest way." My husband finally glanced up. He almost smiled. I sat down and looked at the documents in front of me. And then I thought about the folder sitting in a safety deposit box at a TD branch on King Street West, the one nobody in this room knew existed. I picked up the pen. I should explain how I got there, because it didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen to someone who deserved it. I know everyone says that, but give me a few minutes. I grew up in Sudbury. My father worked the mines for 23 years, and my mother kept the books for 3 different small businesses on the same street. I learned early that money is not something that comes to you. It's something you understand, track, protect, or lose. My mother had a saying she repeated so often it became background noise. A number you don't watch is a number that disappears. I didn't fully appreciate it until much later. I moved to Toronto at 20 for a finance degree at Ryerson, worked evenings at a Spadina Avenue cafe, finished at the top of my cohort, got a junior analyst position at a mid-size investment advisory firm on Adelaide Street. That's where I met him. At a client event, one of those rooftop parties in the summer where everyone is slightly too loud and slightly too impressed with themselves. He was charming in that effortless way that, I now understand, takes a great deal of practice. His name was Garrison. His family had built Beaumont and Sons in the 90s, commercial real estate development across Ontario. Offices in Toronto, a portfolio in Hamilton, some residential projects in Barrie. Respectable, not empire level, but solid. His father had died 3 years earlier and left the business split, 40% to Garrison, 40% to his older brother Elliot, and 20% to their mother Constance. Garrison and Elliot had not spoken properly in 2 years by the time I came into the picture. The business was drifting. Elliot was reckless with capital. He pushed through 2 development deals that lost the company over $2 million combined, and Garrison was too conflict-averse to stop him. Constance pretended not to notice because acknowledging problems had never been her way. Within 18 months of joining the company, Garrison had brought me in as CFO, a decision that raised every eyebrow in the family. I had restructured the debt, renegotiated 3 supplier contracts, caught an accounting error that had been quietly compounding for 4 years, and stabilized the cash flow enough that the company could actually breathe again. Elliot fought me on everything. Constance treated me like a personal assistant who had accidentally wandered into the boardroom. Garrison said thank you in private and said nothing in public. We got married in September at a vineyard in Prince Edward County. It was a beautiful wedding. I have almost no photographs of it anymore. For the next 5 years, I built that company. Not rebuilt. Built. The bones were there, the name had goodwill, but the strategy, the financing structures, the new partnerships with 3 municipal development authorities, the pivot into mixed-use residential that tripled their portfolio value, that was mine. Every spreadsheet, every late night, every call I took at 7 in the morning while Garrison was still asleep. The articles in the business press quoted him. The award at the Toronto Real Estate Forum had his name on it. At the family Christmas dinners, Constance would describe the company's success to relatives while I sat 2 chairs away and passed the potatoes. I stopped being angry about it somewhere around year 4, not because I accepted it, because I started planning something else entirely. The marriage ended technically because of something small. Garrison forgot our 6th anniversary. Not in the way you forget a small thing, in the way that tells you the thing was never important to begin with. When I mentioned it, he said he'd had a stressful week. When I pushed, he said I was too focused on keeping score. When I cried, and I'm not proud of how long it took me to cry, because I had been holding everything so tightly for so long, he looked at me with something close to irritation and said, "You've always made everything harder than it needs to be." I called my mother that night from the guest bathroom. She listened. Then she said, very quietly, "A number you don't watch is a number that disappears." I think she meant me. I think she'd been watching me disappear for years. I filed for divorce 4 months later. What followed was uglier than I expected, and I had expected it to be ugly. Elliot, who had always wanted me out of the company, suddenly became Garrison's closest advisor. Constance retained Edward Croft, the same lawyer who had handled the company's incorporation, to represent the family's interests, which apparently included her son's interests in the divorce. Garrison's personal lawyer was a man named Douglas Webb, who had a reputation on Bay Street for being particularly aggressive in asset disputes. Their position, my role in the company, had been as an employee, essentially. I had been compensated with a salary and bonuses, the equity stake. The 40% Garrison had transferred to me in year 2 as a tax structure our accountant had recommended should revert because it had never truly been intended as a personal asset. It was, in their framing, a corporate mechanism, not a marital gift. It was, in reality, 40% of a company now worth approximately $68 million. I had my own lawyer. Her name was Patricia Anand, mid-50s, sharp, unhurried in a way that made opposing counsel underestimate her consistently. She reviewed everything and told me our position was strong but not bulletproof. The equity transfer documentation was clean. The tax filings supported my ownership. But Garrison's team was going to argue intent, and intent is the kind of thing that gets expensive and slow in front of a judge. Then 3 weeks before the scheduled mediation, something happened. Patricia called me on a Tuesday evening. She'd received a disclosure package from Douglas Webb's office. Included in it was a document I had apparently signed, a shareholder agreement amendment from 18 months earlier, in which I had agreed that in the event of marital dissolution, my shares would revert to the Beaumont Family Trust at a fixed buyout price of $1.2 million. I had never signed that document. I sat in my apartment on Davenport Road, a 1-bedroom I had rented after moving out of the family home in Rosedale, a place so quiet in the evenings that I could hear my neighbor's television through the wall, and I read that document 3 times. The signature looked like mine. The date was from a Tuesday afternoon when I had been in a meeting at the company's Hamilton office with 2 junior analysts and our project manager. I called Patricia back and said, "I was in Hamilton that day. There are at least 3 people who can place me there." She said, "I know. I need you to find every document you signed around that period, anything with your signature on it." Here is the thing about spending 8 years as the person who actually runs a company's finances. You keep records, not because you're suspicious, because your mother told you over and over that a number you don't watch is a number that disappears. I had extended that principle to everything: emails, meeting notes, physical copies of significant documents organized by quarter stored in 2 locations. The safety deposit box at the TD branch on King Street West held, among other things, a signed and notarized copy of the original shareholder agreement, the one with no reversion clause, along with a letter from the company's previous accountant confirming the structure of my equity stake and its unconditional nature, dated and countersigned. It also held something else: something I had discovered 14 months earlier and said nothing about because I hadn't known yet what I was going to do with it. The mediation was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in a boardroom at a downtown law office on Bay Street, 3 blocks from the Exchange Tower. These things are supposed to be neutral. Everyone sits on opposite sides of a long table, a mediator in the middle, and you negotiate. Garrison's team had requested it as an alternative to litigation. Patricia had agreed, because she wanted to see their full hand before we decided whether to let a judge see ours. I arrived first. I was wearing a dark gray blazer over a white shirt, my hair pulled back, a small silver pin on my lapel, a cedar branch which I'd found at a craft market in Kensington years ago, and had worn to every important meeting since. People never mentioned it. It was mine to know about. Garrison came in with Douglas Webb and Elliot. Elliot was not technically a party to the divorce proceedings. He had no legal standing to be there, but he sat down at the table anyway, and Douglas Webb didn't introduce him, and the mediator, a pleasant man named Gerald from a downtown ADR firm, looked at him briefly and said nothing. Constance was not present, but I knew she'd been briefed before breakfast. Garrison looked tired. He had circles under his eyes and his collar was slightly off. Part of me, the part I'm least proud of, noticed this and felt nothing. Douglas Webb opened by summarizing their position. The shareholder reversion agreement was valid. The $1.2 million buyout was fair compensation for my operational contributions, and proceeding to litigation would be costly and damaging for both parties and the company's reputation. He said reputation the way people say it when they mean my client's reputation specifically. Patricia listened. She took 3 notes on a yellow legal pad and did not look up. When he finished, she said, "The document your client is relying on was not signed by my client. We have evidence placing her in Hamilton on the date indicated with 3 corroborating witnesses, none of whom have any relationship to her outside of their professional roles. We also have a forensic document examiner who has reviewed the signature and identified 17 inconsistencies compared to authenticated samples." The room went quiet in a very particular way, not the quiet of people thinking, the quiet of people recalculating. Douglas Webb said, "That's a serious allegation." Patricia said, "It's a serious document." Garrison was looking at the table. Elliot was looking at Garrison. Patricia opened her folder and placed a copy of the original shareholder agreement, the notarized one from the safety deposit box, in front of Gerald the mediator. Then she placed the accountant's letter. Then she placed a 16-page analysis from the forensic examiner. Then she placed one more document. She slid it across the table without comment. It was a printout of a series of wire transfers, internal company transfers, over a period of 14 months, totaling just under $400,000, moved from a Beaumont & Sons operational account into a numbered holding company registered in Alberta. The numbered company's sole director was Elliot. I had found this 14 months ago during a routine audit I conducted for my own records. I had not reported it to the board. I had not confronted Elliot. I had put the printout in the safety deposit box and gone home and made dinner and thought for a long time about my mother saying, the number I was watching was finally going somewhere. Garrison looked at the document. Then he looked at his brother. Elliot's face did something I don't have a precise word for. It went through 3 or 4 expressions in about 2 seconds. Confusion, then recognition, then something that was almost panic dressed up as anger. He said, "Where did you get that?" Patricia said pleasantly, "That's not really the relevant question right now, is it?" Douglas Webb put his hand on Garrison's arm and leaned in. They had a whispered exchange. Gerald, the mediator, was reviewing the wire transfer document with the careful attention of a man who has seen many things in boardrooms and knows when he is seeing something significant. Elliot stood up. He said to me directly, the first time he had addressed me directly in about 3 years, "You've been sitting on that." I looked at him. "I've been watching." The mediation did not conclude that day. These things rarely do, but something shifted in that room and everyone felt it. Douglas Webb requested a recess. Patricia granted it without visible concern. Garrison and Elliot stepped out into the hallway, and I could hear, through the glass partition, the shape of an argument, even if not the words, the way you can tell a storm is happening from the pressure in the air. Constance arrived 40 minutes later. Nobody had called her apparently. Elliot had. She walked in wearing a charcoal wool coat, her reading glasses in her hand, and she looked at the documents on the table one by one with the expression of a woman discovering that the house she has lived in for 30 years has a room she never opened. She sat down, she looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "To Douglas Webb, not to me. What exactly is the exposure here?" He told her, "Not all of it. Lawyers are careful in rooms with mediators, but enough. The forged document alone was a serious problem. The wire transfers were a separate serious problem. The combination was the kind of thing that does not stay in a mediation boardroom." Constance was quiet for a while. She set her glasses on the table very precisely, the way she did everything. Then she said, to nobody in particular, "Elliot, you need to leave the room." Elliot said, "Mother." Now. He left. What happened over the next 3 hours I will summarize because some of it involved legal discussions that are confidential, and some of it I have simply chosen to keep for myself. The short version: the forged reversion agreement was withdrawn. Douglas Webb submitted in writing that his client wished to retract the document from proceedings. The wire transfer documentation was referred by the mediator, who had an obligation to do so, to an appropriate authority. Elliot retained his own lawyer by 4 o'clock that afternoon. My 40% stake in Beaumont & Sons Holdings was confirmed unconditionally as a marital asset subject to equitable division under Ontario family law. Patricia and I were in a very good position. I did not feel triumphant walking out of that building. I felt tired in the bone-deep way that comes at the end of something long, and I stood on Bay Street for a minute in the November cold. Toronto in November has a particular cold, damp and direct, the kind that finds the gaps in your coat, and I just breathed. My phone rang. It was my mother, calling from Sudbury because I had texted her that morning to say today's the day. I said it went okay. She said, "What does okay mean?" I said, "It means I watched the number." She was quiet for a second, and then she made a sound that I had not heard from her in a long time. Not quite a laugh. More like relief, finally surfacing. The divorce was finalized 7 months later. The financial settlement was fair, not everything I might have argued for, but fair in the way that things are fair when both sides know exactly where they stand. Garrison and I did not speak much during that period. At the end, there was a brief conversation in Patricia's office while we waited for the final signatures, and he said, not looking at me, "Looking at the window, you could have used that information differently. Reported it earlier. Made things worse for Elliot." I said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you?" I thought about it. Because I wasn't angry, I was just waiting to be done. I don't know if he understood that. I think there's a kind of patience that looks, from the outside, like coldness, and I've stopped trying to explain the difference to people who haven't needed it. The Beaumont family dealt with Elliot's situation through a combination of private restitution and very expensive legal arrangements that I am not at liberty to describe. I heard through Patricia that he had relocated to Calgary. I have not thought about him much since. Beaumont & Sons Holdings, as it happened, was acquired 14 months after my divorce was finalized. A real estate investment trust based in Vancouver purchased a controlling interest at a valuation that reflected, largely, the portfolio and partnerships I had built over 8 years. My shares at that valuation represented a sum that made my old salary look like a rounding error. I bought a house in the annex. A proper one, with a garden in the back, which I have been slowly learning to care for in the way my mother cared for everything, with attention, with patience, with the understanding that things grow on their own schedule regardless of what you think you need from them. I set up my own advisory practice the following spring, small, intentional, focused on mid-sized family businesses navigating ownership transitions. I am selective about clients. I have learned perhaps too well what it costs to give your expertise to people who have decided in advance what you're worth. Constance called me once, about 8 months after everything concluded. I almost didn't answer. When I did, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "I want you to know I didn't know about the document." I said, "I believe you." Another silence. "Then you were good for that company." It was the most she had ever said to me, and she said it like it cost her something, so I let it stand without adding anything to it. I hung up and looked out my kitchen window at the garden. The cedar tree in the back corner. It was already there when I bought the house, old and very still, was doing what it always does in November, just standing there, roots deep, waiting out the season. I made myself a cup of tea and sat with it for a while, and I didn't feel like I'd won anything exactly. I felt like I had finally stopped losing and understood, for the first time in a long time, the difference. There's a moment near the end of that mediation, after the wire transfer documents hit the table, after Elliot stood up and said, "Where did you get that?" where everything in the room went completely still. And I remember thinking, this is what it feels like when the truth stops being theoretical. I didn't go into that room looking for revenge. I want to be honest about that because I think the word revenge implies something hot and urgent, and what I carried into that boardroom on Bay Street was neither of those things. It was just information, carefully kept, patiently held. There's a difference between wanting someone to suffer and simply refusing to let them erase you. What Garrison's family did, the forged document, the years of quiet erasure, the assumption that I would accept a number and disappear, came from a particular kind of arrogance. The arrogance of people who have never had to watch carefully because things have always come to them without effort. They assumed I was the same. They never once considered that the person doing the actual work might also be doing the actual watching. That's what I think about when I try to make sense of all of it. Not the betrayal. I've made a kind of peace with that, but the carelessness. Elliot moved $400,000 through a numbered company as if nobody would notice. Garrison signed off on a fabricated document as if the paper itself wouldn't hold the lie. Constance built her entire sense of the family around a story that excluded the one person who was keeping the lights on. None of it was sustainable. It was always going to come apart. The only question was whether I would be standing somewhere solid when it did. I learned this from my mother, though she never put it in those terms. She learned it from years of keeping books for other people's businesses, the discipline of seeing things as they actually are, not as you hope or fear them to be. That's what I try to carry into my own work now. Clarity. Integrity about the numbers, about the relationships, about what you actually built and what you're actually owed. It sounds boring when you say it plainly, but it's the kind of thing that holds you together when everything else is trying to pull you apart. And the endurance part, the years of doing the work without recognition, the months of sitting quietly with documents that could have changed everything and choosing to wait, that's the part I'm most grateful for now. Not because patience is virtuous in some abstract sense, but because it gave me time to understand exactly what I had. You can't use what you don't fully understand. I needed to understand it completely before I put it on the table. Constance called me eventually and said I had been good for that company. I believed her and I let it be enough. Not because I needed her validation, I was well past that by then, but because I recognized it cost her something to say, and there's a kind of honesty in that worth acknowledging. The cedar tree in my backyard in the annex was old before I got there. It doesn't need anything from me. It just keeps growing, regardless of the season, regardless of what's happening in the house nearby. I think about that sometimes when things are hard. Some things are built to last. not because they were protected from difficulty, but because their roots went down deep enough, early enough, that the difficult seasons couldn't reach them. I hope that's true of me. I'm still finding out,